gathered is part of Treaty 19, lands and territory of the Mississauga of the Credit. We are fortunate to have the service of an American Sign Language interpreter on stage tonight, Heather Baldwin. Good evening. My name is Diane McDermott, and as president of CFEW Georgetown, I am pleased to welcome everyone tonight. The Canadian Federation of University Women in Georgetown is one of over 100 such clubs across the country, whose mission it is to improve the status of women, promote human rights, education, social justice, and civic engagement. Nationally, we are celebrating our 100th anniversary. The program this evening is a collaborative effort. Our partners are the Halton Hills Public Library, Halton Environmental Network, and the Green PAC 100 Debates Initiative. Many of you are familiar with the format of our CFUW All Candidates Debates, and that remains a part of tonight's program, but later. Our moderator for that portion is our own Margaret Teasdale. This gathering is special. Tonight, our community is participating in Green PAC's nationwide 100 debates on the environment that poses the same 4 questions on the same night to federal election candidates in local ridings here, Wellington Halton Hills. To start us off, I am pleased to call on Nicole Kucherenko, our 100 Debates moderator and chair of the board of directors for the Halton Environmental Network.
Incorporated not-for-profit organization operating out of the region of Halton since 2004. The Halton Environmental Network, or HEN, supports and enhances the capacity for local climate action and environmental sustainability across the region of Halton. HEN facilitates communication, cooperation, resources, and alignment with other not-for-profit groups, government, faith-based communities, school boards, and the private and public sector. It's home of the Halton Green Screens, Greening Sacred Spaces for Halton and Peel, Oakville Ready, and HEN is the backbone agency of the Halton Climate Collective. We are delighted that 5 candidates from our riding are able to join us tonight. I would like to introduce them in the order which they drew at the beginning of this evening. First, from the People's Party of Canada, we have Mr. Sil Carl. From the Liberal Party, Dr. Leslie Barron. Third, from the New Democratic Party, Mr. Andrew Bascom. Fourth, from the Green Party, Mr. Ralph Martin. And fifth, from the Conservative Party, Mr. Michael Chong. To the candidates in advance of this evening's debate. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to respond to each question, and the speaking order will rotate through the candidates. I would like to introduce to the candidates our timer, Anne Ray, sitting here in the front row. When you have 30 seconds left, Anne will raise a yellow card, and when your time has expired, Anne will raise a red card, and you must stop speaking at that time. We will need to strictly follow the timing tonight as we do have a tight schedule. And on that note, I will begin by reading the first question. Around the world, we are seeing inspiring examples of leadership to reduce greenhouse gas pollution and accelerate the shift to a green economy. At the same time, we are seeing a ramp up of the effects of climate change, and the scientific consensus is that we have little more than a decade to turn things around. We see extreme weather events across the country, including wildfires, flooding, and droughts. These are causing anxiety and worry, given their enormous financial and environmental impact. Per person, Canadians produce the most GHG pollution of all G20 industrialized nations, nearly 3 times the G20 average and 8 tons per person. What are the key elements of an action plan that you will advocate to ensure Canada meets its international obligations to reduce GHG pollution. And we'll start with Mr. Silcarl.
Thank you. The People's Party government will address climate by being prepared and not scared. The People's Party is committed to ensuring Canada has the tools and resources to respond to any weather event that Mother Earth bestows upon us. This means that we will be able to respond without delay to effectively address events such as flood, ice storms, with equipment, resources, and personnel immediately, and also be there to assist recovery after the event. Global warming has stalled now for the past 20 years, and it's receding, has been receding for the past 3 years as the sun becomes quiet and in a state classified as a grand solar minimum. These are facts for which science is now exploring as to reasons why. Let me begin with the preamble to the question on the voluntary targets Canada has agreed to. Consensus is not science. The very definition of a scientist is to be skeptic, because the truth should never be afraid of critical questioning. The late Michael Christian put it this way: I regard consensus science as an extremely harmful development that ought to be stopped cold in its tracks. Historically, the claims of consensus has been the first refuge of scoundrels. It is a way to avoid debate by claiming that the matter is already settled.
We will now hear from Dr. Leslie Barron.
Since 1940, it's not the sun.
Fake news.
First, thanks to the Liberal government, we have a price on pollution all across Canada that makes polluters pay while passing on the revenues to Canadians. 8 out of 10 families are getting back more than they pay. Trying to reduce emissions without carbon pricing is like trying to treat diabetes without insulin, ineffective and dangerous. In addition to carbon pricing, there are many other ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But this transition to a green economy doesn't happen on its own. Governments need to take the lead. The Liberal government plans tax breaks for green tech businesses, investing in public transit, planting 2 billion trees, electric vehicle rebates, and a $40,000 interest-free loan for home energy efficiency. As we're doing all of this, the Liberal approach of unmuzzling scientists and relying on advice from experts in fighting climate change will make sure whatever we do is done the right way. It is not enough anymore to acknowledge the existence of climate change. You must elect people who belong to a party prepared to do something about it. And right now, the other parties have plans that are either wildly realistic or just meaningless window dressing. Even when other parties have people in them who seem to have good environmental credentials, they're still part of the problem. The Conservatives won't act to save our planet, and we don't have time to waste waiting for climate change deniers to change their minds. We have to be realistic and effective, and this riding is best placed to elect a new Liberal MP who won't have to fight their own party to take effective action on climate change. Quote, evidence is an ethical issue, perhaps the most important ethical issue in a modern democracy. If you want truth, you must work for justice. But if you want to work for truth, if you want justice, you must work for truth. And if you want to work for truth, you must do a little bit more than work for justice.
We will now hear from Mr. Andrew Bascom.
More education. Education for myself, my fellow members of government, and Canadians on what is truly happening. Demanding an all-parties approach to this crisis. Seeking knowledge from other jurisdictions as to what is working and what isn't. and finding a way to improve on those efficiencies. Make investment in low-carbon transportation infrastructure like public transit, rails, and ferries. Advocating for smarter and greener land use and land allocations. Rezoning of areas that would allow for better use of the space we presently occupy, and implementing better planning strategies for all new developments. Calling for a referendum on what the public, all of you here, are willing to do and how far you are willing to go to meet these challenges. Stop thinking that politicians have the answers to the questions, and remove the barriers that prevent the innovation of technologies and methods that can help address our present and future situation. And most of all, stop talking about it and get it in action.
We'll now hear from Mr. Ralph Martin.
Thank you. I appreciate this opportunity. The Green Party has a Made in Canada plan to address climate change. It is mission possible. Our goal is to reduce greenhouse gases 60% by 2030 and to get to net zero by 2050. This is in line with the recommendations of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and is fully costed by the Parliamentary Budget Office. It will be cost effective as we transition to a clean, caring economy with jobs that persist. We will retrofit buildings across Canada to be carbon neutral, thus creating jobs, reducing heating costs, and reducing GHGs. Revenue neutrality will be achieved with a carbon fee and dividend program, and all subsidies to fossil fuels will be stopped. By 2030, we will rebuild the east-west electricity grid to ensure that renewable energy can be transmitted from one province to another. Replanting forests and incentivizing cover crops will be major thrusts. The Green Party will establish an inner cabinet of all parties, modeled on the war cabinets of Mackenzie King and Winston Churchill. Parties will work together to ensure that climate is no longer treated like a political football. It requires all hands on deck. We have an opportunity to recover the Canadian diplomatic status when Lester Pearson won the Nobel Peace Prize. In the 1980s, Canada was key to restricting global ozone-depleting chemicals with the Montreal Protocol, even though Canadian chemical contributions were minor. Elizabeth May was instrumental in those negotiations. We can also restore and use our diplomatic skills today. Even though Canada emits less than 2% of global GHGs, we can get our own house in order and then punch above our weight diplomatically to move the international climate needle.
We will now hear from Mr. Michael Chong.
Well, thank you to the Halton Environmental Network for hosting this debate. I think it's a very important issue and top of mind for many Canadians. The question was, what are the key elements of a greenhouse gas reduction plan that you would advocate for? You know, in my observations, this country is terribly divided on the issue of not only greenhouse gas reductions, but also energy policy. We have British Columbia and Alberta fighting each other in the court system. We have different views in Quebec than we do in Western Canada, different views in Ontario than in other parts of the country. And so I think what we need to do is build a consensus. And I think there is a consensus about a sector-by-sector regulatory approach to reduce emissions. For example, about a quarter of all Canada's emissions come from the tailpipes of automobiles, trucks, and locomotives. I think a regulatory approach rather than a carbon tax to reduce those emissions is the way to go. California has led the way on that. California has issued corporate average fuel economy standards that have led North America in reducing tailpipe emissions for decades. So I think that's one area in which we can work. I think the other thing we need to do is to work across the aisle with all parties to achieve a consensus on this issue. Elizabeth May and I worked on this issue most recently about 3 months ago, where we co-authored a letter and to Environment Minister, Climate Change Minister Catherine McKenna, encouraging her to not go down the route of the Trump administration and ensure that Canada holds the line on these corporate average fuel economy standards that have been established by California. So it's things like that, I think, that will move us in the right direction. The fact of the matter is that none of the parties have a plan to get us to the Paris Agreement accord of holding warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the fact of the matter is that both conservative and liberal governments have failed to uphold our climate change commitments, whether it's Kyoto, Copenhagen, or Paris to come. So that's why I think we need MPs in all parties to work together to hold governments accountable on this very important issue.
Many Canadians know that our country has the longest coastline in the world. Less well known is that Canada is home to roughly half of the waters of the world's lakes and an equivalent volume of the world's freshwater and roughly 1/4 of the world's wetlands. Canada is seeing the impact that industrial development and climate change is having on our water resources. We are seeing the re-emergence of pollution hotspots like Lake Erie, and the Insurance Bureau of Canada has noted that climate change, as well as the historic loss of wetlands across Canada due to industrial development, has led to a massive 250% increase in flooding over the past 2 decades, as well as a reduction in water quality and wildlife habitat. What can the federal government do to work with different sectors, like municipalities and farmers, to reduce both water pollution and the risk of flood events, which have been aggravated by industrial development and climate change? For this question, we will start with Dr. Leslie Barron.
Flood events like we saw in Ottawa and Bracebridge this past spring are going to be more frequent and more damaging. In March, there was extreme risk from potential ice jams locally, right here in Glen Williams. The town had to call in a company specializing in explosives for the first time in decades. If re-elected, the Liberals have promised a low-cost national flood insurance program, but even with that support, there will be some areas where riverside and lakeside properties are going to be uninhabitable due to frequent flooding. The Liberal Party plans to work with the provinces to complete all flood maps in Canada, so developers know in the future where not to build. For homes in the highest risk zones, on the agenda is a national action plan to help homeowners with potential relocation. There are a lot of farmers in this riding, and I know many are worried about extreme weather events like flooding and drought. The Liberals are preparing to increase federal support for farmers who are affected by those risks. We've even funded research at the nearby University of Guelph to look into reducing irrigation needed for crops, and funded research to reduce the need for pesticide and fertilizer, whose runoff ends up in our water supply. This contributes to toxic blue-green algae outbreaks here and locally in Fairy Lake and Bellwood that can make swimming dangerous for us, our kids, and even our pets. Here in this riding, I have met with the Save the Water group in Elora, who are working to prevent Nestle from accessing more of Elora's groundwater, packaging it in water bottles and sending it across the country. The work they do is a good example of local people stepping up to advocate for the environment and the water where they live. But they can't do it alone, and people who should be on their side, like the Ford government, aren't reliable when it comes to protecting the environment against big business. The federal government needs to step in to help, and out of all the parties up here this evening, only the Liberals have a proven track record of environmental defense of resources such as our water.
We will now hear from Mr. Andrew Bascom.
As a member of the NDP and in keeping with what the policies of the party are, we would put in place a national action plan that removes the present barriers that prevent municipalities and farmers from taking action on their own. We would increase the federal funding to help them respond to disasters, as well as work with communities to protectively adapt their infrastructure and withstand extreme weather events like flooding, and providing them equipment to fight wildfires. We'd also ensure that companies such as Nestle, which is just down from where I work in Butchlish, would have to follow stricter laws and regulations when it comes to removing the water, and prevent them from taking water to end the use of water for profit. One of the other issues that we face in regards to the taking of water is the creation of single-use plastics, as well as water bottles, which end up in our oceans and trickle down, and they're decomposing to microplastics that end up in our food and our water. We would also protect the ocean biodiversity by expanding well-informed marine protected areas, work to prevent ocean acidification, and reverse the loss of coastal blue carbon ecosystems such as salt marshes. But mostly, we would start taking action immediately.
Mr. Ralph Martin.
I appreciate the water I have here tonight. Locally as Greens, we work to protect water. Mike Schreiner, the sole Green MPP at Queen's Park, worked across party lines and got unanimous approval for his Periscope Moraine bill in the second reading. The Green Party is strongly in favor of protecting and maintaining clean water, our water, which is a public trust. The Green Party will develop a national water strategy to ensure safe drinking water in collaboration with provinces, territories, municipal local governments, and Indigenous peoples. The last national water strategy was delivered in the late 1980s and was never fully implemented. Our goal is to protect a minimum of 30% of fresh water and land by 2030. We recognize that water infrastructure is crucial, and thus we will climate-proof drinking water and wastewater systems to protect against flooding, droughts, and contamination. We will also increase green infrastructure by protecting watersheds and wetlands. The Green Party will establish a national program to restore buffer zones around waterways through tree planting and soil rebuilding. We will support farmers in protecting wildlife habitat areas, water quality, and building soil quality on their lands. A good example is the Erin Soil Health Coalition. They relate good practices in the kitchen to good practices on the land. This can be a quadruple win approach, whereby farmers adding more carbon to the soil, 1, draw down CO2 from the atmosphere, 2, improve soil quality and thus crop yields, 3, improve water filtration, and 4, improve human health.
We will now hear from Mr. Michael Chong.
Well, thank you for the question. Question was about what will the federal government do working with farmers and municipalities to reduce pollution and flooding in the Great Lakes watersheds. It's clear we have a pollution problem. There is a lot of nutrient runoff still, phosphorus, nitrogen, going into the Great Lakes, particularly Lake Erie, which is the shallowest of the Great Lakes. There was several years ago, Toledo had to shut down its drinking water system because of the toxic algae bloom that was taking place there. And clearly we still have flooding. We had flooding in Drayton and Wellington County about a year ago during the spring runoff. So I think one of the most effective things we can do, there's a whole bunch of other things we can do, but they're outside of federal jurisdiction, like dealing with land use planning and sprawl and all those sorts of things. What the federal government can do is to continue to fund the Canada-Ontario Environmental Farm Plan and Canada-Ontario Farm Stewardship Program. These programs have been in place since 1993. Federal and provincial governments have funded them. They're shared cost, voluntary programs that farmers can take advantage of to do things like build nutrient management facilities to ensure that runoff doesn't take place, to set aside riparian areas that are marginal for agricultural production and restore them to woodlots, to put in windbreaks and trees to prevent soil erosion. So what all these things do is they prevent flooding by allowing the soil to act more like a sponge, and they also improve the water quality downriver for the Great Lakes system. So those are things we need to do. I think the other thing we need to do, which the Conservatives are proposing, is to ban the dumping of raw sewage into our watersheds. That is still taking place in Canada. It's unbelievable to say, but one of the first acts of the current government was to allow the City of Montreal to dump millions and millions of liters of raw, untreated sewage into the St. Lawrence River. We would ban that practice. We don't think that's good for the environment. So these are things that we need to do to clean up our Great Lakes and our freshwater system.
Mr. Phil Carl.
Environmental policies are the domain of the provinces unless the issues cross over provincial boundaries. As vast a country as Canada is, Mother Nature is telling us that our growth rate is unsustainable. If we are to take the position that this is troubling, we need to listen. Population growth needs to be reduced to maintaining our population numbers not growing it. It is illogical to think that we can carry on with these levels of unsustainable growth and have little to no impact on our environment. A people's government will bring forward policy and strengthen legislation to ensure our water is drinkable in every communities in Canada. This is not excluding anyone. Everyone in Canada will have clean drinking water with a People's Party government. We will also strengthen legislation so that we maintain clean air. The dumping of raw sewage into the St. Lawrence or coastal waters where whales and sea lions live is unacceptable and will be stopped. The People's Government will resolve these issues with funding assistance where required for modern treatment facilities and apply emergency implementation to fix these sites as quickly as humanly possible, all the while respecting the provincial jurisdictions.
When asked about what they most love about our country, Canadians point first to natural beauty, wildlife, and spectacular wilderness areas. Yet, we are falling below our international commitments to protect these spaces and our parks and other protected areas. And they are not funded at the level needed to conserve the diverse plants and animals that live there. A recent study shows that 50% of Canadian wildlife species are in decline. 94% of Canadians value the emotional and physical benefits of spending time in nature. However, 82% say they're concerned that future generations won't have close or easy access to nature. What will you do to protect the quality and quantity of wilderness in Canada? And for this question, we will start with Mr. Andrew Bascom.
One of the reasons my wife and I chose to move from Brampton to Acton is because we felt the need to be closer to the wilderness in the area, and we're getting tired of the concrete jungle that Brampton is slowly becoming. We have a trailer which we use to go camping on a regular basis when the weather allows, and we have a attachment to the need for open space and the enjoyment of trees and animals. What I would propose for my party to do, and what I would advocate for myself to do, is to take steps that not only meet but begin the process of exceeding our international commitments. Set aside more land, waters, oceans, so that we can turn back the damage done to our wildlife. We would increase funding that is needed, provide more protected green space, and place more species on the endangered list so that we can find ways to protect our Indigenous people's use of those resources at the same time. Plant more trees to help lower our carbon footprint, and find ways of building new homes that do not require clear cutting of the existing trees, only to replant less trees than what was removed. And then take whatever measures all levels of governments can to protect our biodiversity. Support the creation of Indigenous managed protected areas to make sure that such species recovery efforts uphold Indigenous rights and embrace traditional knowledge to increase biodiversity, expand marine protected areas to protect ocean biodiversity, and fight back against invasive species. Thank you.
We will now hear from Mr. Ralph Martin.
I think this is the point where we should all stand up and go outside and go for a walk. The Globe and Mail reported last January that the world's Indigenous groups, despite their small and declining share of the global population, manage 80% of Earth's biodiversity, in part because their ancestral lands make up 22% of the world's land surface. By preserving forests, lakes, rivers, and other ecosystems on their territories, they play an indispensable role in climate change mitigation and adaptation. Protection of wilderness also presents an opportunity for reconciliation in Canada. The Green Party has ecological wisdom as a core value. Humans and all species of plant and animals are integral and interdependent parts of a living planet. We will increase funding to federal departments for endangered species protection. There will be $100 million per year for 4 years for Indigenous-led, protected, and conserved areas. That is to fund stewardship of these lands and waters by Indigenous guardians. The Green Party will fully restore the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act to its pre-Harper era strength. That was one of the tragedies of the Harper government, in my opinion. We will increase funding to Parks Canada to protect ecological integrity. We will also develop a national forest strategy, including more trees and with fire breaks. In my new book on food security, I discuss the alarming rate of the extinction of species. Late last year, the World Wildlife Federation reported that wildlife populations declined by over 60% within the last 40 years. Thank you.
We will now hear from Mr. Michael Chong.
Well, protecting wilderness and wild spaces in this country is a very important thing for us to do as Canadians. It's part of our culture and our identity. I can tell you, I remember the first time I took a canoe trip through Canoe Lake in Algonquin Park and did my first portage. I think it was into Joe Lake. Those things never leave you. I've tripped across most of northern Ontario, actually. In late October one year, a friend of mine and I, we actually canoed up the Missinaibi River from Matisse to Moosonee. We almost froze in the rain. Well, it's never been so cold in my life. But I really do believe in protecting our wild spaces. Canada has international commitments to protect 10% of our marine coastal areas and coastal waters, and 17% of our territory, of our fresh lakes and our land mass. The current government has only met the first commitment, which is just over 10% of Canada's marine and coastal areas have been protected, but has yet to fulfill the second commitment, which is 17% of our land mass. Only about 11% of our land mass has been protected. Mr. Harper actually was the Prime Minister at the time who committed to these international goals in 2011, I believe it was. So we have more work to do. I'm committed to doing that work. It's one of the reasons why I worked with a number of people on both sides of the aisle to establish a new national park here in the Greater Toronto Area, Rouge National Urban Park. We secured 15,000 acres and some $142 million in the fiscal framework to ensure that that park is sustainable in the future. The work to establish that park has just begun. They're actually going to site a new visitor center somewhere around Meadowvale and Shepherd Avenue in Toronto, and it will be a unique feature in the Eastern Deciduous Forest Zone. It's one of the reasons why I've been endorsed by GreenPAC for my work on protecting wilderness areas. GreenPAC is an organization made up of leading environmentalists. It's one of the co-sponsors of this debate, and I'm very proud of that endorsement. You can find out more at greenpac.ca. That's greenpac.ca.
Mr. Silcarl.
Our well-intentioned desire to transition to a green economy cannot be allowed to destroy our environment for the sake of fighting global warming. Solar farms use up large parcels of land that can no longer be used for growing crops that feed people. Most wildlife disappears from these sites. Industrial wind farms are killing large birds and bats by the millions. An entire subspecies of migrating bats is dangerously threatened with extinction by the very tools sold to us as our saviors. You'll remember the Green Energy Act. Our government will work with the companies involved in lumber harvest and mining to arrive at acceptable strategies that will ensure our natural resources are well protected for future generations. The People's Party will work not only to continue the previous efforts in this regard, but will be proactively assessing the overall results thus far and will make the necessary and often difficult decisions in order to ensure the ongoing quality and quantity of our rich Canadian resources. Our lakes, rivers, forests, and clear blue skies are a priority for the People's Party. Canada has a geography that defines us. It is every Canadian's responsibility to ensure this great resource legacy remains for our children and generations to come. Now, on a personal level,
and peace flag.
We will now hear from Dr. Leslie Barron.
Canada has seen a big decline in species diversity due to climate change, human activity, and industrial and urban development. If re-elected, the Liberals aim to protect 25% of Canada's land and ocean areas by 2025. As a surgeon, I can tell you access to the outdoors is beneficial for all, to the point where physicians are now writing prescriptions for people to walk in the woods. We're lucky to have a lot of trails and conservation areas in this riding, and I'd like everyone and their kids and grandkids to be able to enjoy our wilderness. When I ran for office, one of the reasons I chose the Liberals is because I think they're serious about protecting Canada's wilderness. Since 2015, they've added 130,000 square kilometres to Canada's network of protected areas. They had a lot of catching up to do after the previous Conservative government spent a decade watering down environmental protections. The current crop of Conservatives voted against most of the Liberals' moves to protect what matters to Canadians. I think we can still have industry and agriculture and develop our natural resources without sacrificing the environment. And I think the Liberals have struck the right balance.
Canada has made big strides to improve the health of Canadians and our environment by regulating toxic substances. Legal limits on lead in gasoline, restricting chemicals like DDT and ozone-depleting substances, the Canada-US acid rain agreement, and the phase out of coal-fired electricity have had an enormous positive impact on the health of Canadians and our environment, saving lives, preventing illnesses, and saving billions of dollars in avoided healthcare costs. However, air pollution is still the leading environmental cause of death and illness in Canada, and Canada remains the only Western industrialized nation without legally binding national air pollution standards. In addition, our laws and regulations have not kept pace with emerging threats from newer toxic substances in our environment, including pesticides in our food and other harmful chemicals in everyday consumer products. Many of these substances have demonstrated links to cancer, genetic damage, developmental problems, chronic illness, and many other health effects. These effects are often more severe for children and other vulnerable populations. Our overarching toxics law, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, has not been significantly strengthened in 20 years. What will you do to ensure that Canadians are better protected from the health and environmental impacts of toxic substances? Will you commit to strengthening the Canadian Environmental Protection Act and the Pest Control Products Act? For this question, we will start with Mr. Ralph Martin.
Thank you. The Green Party will protect the right to a healthy environment for all Canadians. The precautionary principle will be a guide when making decisions about approvals of substances and projects where there is no scientific proof of safety. And the Green Party will strengthen the Canadian Environmental Protection Act and limit approval, use of toxic chemicals that affect health and the environment. Microfibers will also be regulated as a toxic substance. We will also legislate the right to a healthy environment, including public participation rights, transparency in decision-making, wider access to judicial review in court. Pesticide monitoring will be improved, including human health impacts. And in my field in agriculture, there is an increasing trend in cropping systems to control weeds instead of with pesticides, with robotic weeders, and they're called robots, R-O-W bots. They go down between the rows of corn, they have their solar panel that sticks up above the corn that energizes them. They work 24/7, and if they sense a weed, they either punch it in or pull it out. My work in organic agriculture shows me how farmers can be profitable without synthetic pesticides. I understand that not all will make this choice, and yet I also know that organic research will assist all farmers, and non-organic farmers contribute to how organic farmers improve their systems too. For example, no tillage has many benefits, and the teasing of organic farmers for using too much diesel to cultivate crops is now resulting in a roller crimper. And as a Mennonite background, I'm not supposed to be proud, but the roller crimper was invented in a Mennonite machine shop. And that roller crimper makes a mat out of the fall rye into which organic soybean can be no-till. And this fascinating story is in my new book, Food Security.
Thank you. We'll now hear from Mr. Michael Chong.
Well, toxic substances obviously have a negative impact on Canadians' health. And so the question was, what will you commit to strengthening the Canadian Environmental Protection Act and the Pest Control Products Act? And so I'd say there's several things I think we can do. Two things that I think we should do that are non-legislative, and one that is legislative. The two non-legislative things I think we should do is I think we should first conduct another review of the some 23,000 chemicals that are in use in Canada. Up to the late 1990s, there were about 23,000 chemicals in use in Canada that never had gone through an assessment for their deleterious effects on human health or on the environment. Legislation that was passed in the 1980s and 1990s came into effect, and the government began that review. That review was conducted and completed in 2006, but in the last 12, 13 years, new scientific evidence has come forward, and I think that needs to be incorporated into the review of these chemicals. So I think that's the first thing we need to do. I think the second thing we need to do is we need to demand better data from applicants. The PMRA, which is the Pest Management Regulatory Agency of Canada, which regulates a lot of the biocides used by farmers across this country, often is given conditional approvals for biocides, and on the condition that the applicants provide further evidence, further peer-reviewed evidence, as to the deleterious effects on human health or the environment. The problem is these conditional approvals often have been in place for a decade or more, and PMRA has not demanded the applicants provide that research. So I think that's the second thing we need to do. The third thing is legislative. I think we should take a look at amending legislation to put in that legislation a precautionary principle with respect to the development of any new chemicals or substances that would be approved in the future. And I think that would strengthen protection of human health and the environment. So those are three things I think we need to do to strengthen the regulation of toxic substances for the health and the environment of Canadians.
Mr. Sil Carl.
As technology evolves, so should the laws protecting our environment and human health. As well-intentioned as we may have been, solar panels are a perfect example of our failure to assess all the risks associated with technology prior to deploying it on a grand scale. Hoping that industrial processes would exist to neutralize their impact on the environment when the technology reaches the end of its life cycle is not sound environmental management. As any business model, hope is never a strategy, and solar technology should not have been the exception because we got emotionally involved with it. Despite our well-meaning desire to recycle millions of tons of plastic and keep it out of our environment, our oceans are filled with it. Finger-pointing always draws the ire of the crowds, but the People's Party killed political correctness a year ago. It isn't the Credit River that's covered in plastic. It is the rivers of the developing world. We simply cannot allow toxic technology, such as spent solar panels and any other type of wastes, to leave our borders and to end up in their rivers, or eventually in our oceans. The People's Party supports now and will continue to support the proper disposal of all toxic products and will swiftly close loopholes when they are found so that cheaters are held to account.
Leslie Barron.
I remember growing up just outside of Hamilton and driving down the 403 on a hot summer day. You could see a yellow-brown smog lying over the city. I also remember my mom asking for $5 worth of regular being leaded gas when we were at the gas station, a known heavy metal. Now, thanks to the closure of coal-fired gas plants in Ontario and new fuel standards that have removed lead from our gasoline, our air is cleaner to breathe. We know that to get results on something as far-ranging as pollution from toxins, the government has to step in, and we still have a lot to do in terms of the issue of air pollution in Canada. That's one of the reasons the Liberals are planning to move forward to strengthen Canada's Environmental Protection Act. As for how to confront the big challenges of today's generation, I think a great example is the proposed ban on single-use plastics. It will keep harmful microplastics out of our environment, but it'll be paired with new standards and targets for manufacturers, putting more onus on them to keep those plastics out of the hands of consumers in the first place. As for things like pesticides, the Liberals did restrict the use of neonicotinoid pesticides to take the pressure off of bees and other pollinators, and they've launched a review of the way we reevaluate pesticides. Pollinators like bees are critical to our food supply, and we must fund scientists to track these environmental threats and then listen and act on the information they give us. Who do you trust to protect your environment? Conservatives with a history of weakening our regulations, or a government with a proven track record of environmental protection balanced with the economy?
Mr. Andrew Bascom.
I'm going to keep this short and sweet since it is the last question for this segment of the debate. During the late 70s and early 80s, the United States and Canada came to an agreement in regards to the acid rain that was polluting our lakes. They did this by having the producers of the substances that were causing the acid rain clean up their act and give us the environment that we needed. They did this without taking a penny from each of us pockets. The present Liberal government feels that they are brave enough, bold enough to put a price on pollution, as they call it. We've always paid a price for pollution. Your health, the environment, the extinction of species, those are the costs of an environment that we're not taking care of. The NDP, myself, would do our job in making sure that we approve a Bill of Rights that would accommodate the environment and allow for all communities to have a guarantee of clean water, land, air, and a Federal Environment Bill of Rights to commit to strengthening the Canadian Environmental Protection Act and the Pest Control Act.
I will now invite the CFUW to the podium to continue the debate. Thank you.
Good evening, bonsoir. We'll continue with the rotation as it was, but first of all, I will announce the last question. Once this last question has been answered, we'll start with the final remarks. And each candidate we'll start with candidate number 5 and go this way because we first started from candidate number 1 on to that way. I will now read general questions that people wrote down and wanted me to ask for them this evening. And the first question is from Jackie Sullivan. Today I'm here with my 18-year-old son who is voting for his first time. Why should today's youth vote for you? And we'll start with Mr. Michael Chalmers.
Well, thank you, Jackie, for the question. I believe that younger people should vote, and I believe that your son should vote for me. I'm sure we'll get into the same answer. But I'll tell you why. I am committed to greater democratic participation in this country. I believe that political parties need to be a lot more open. I think political membership should be a lot more open. I think Parliament should be a lot more open. I think members of Parliament should better reflect the views of their constituents rather than the party line or the party leader or the Prime Minister. And so that younger people came out in the millions last election. In fact, in the last election, voter turnout jumped from 60 to 70%. Just under 2 million new voters came out, and most of them voted for the Liberal Party, and that was a good thing. But a lot of them voted for the Liberal Party because of the promise of democratic electoral reform. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. But I don't believe that people should despair about it. People, parties, and leaders break promises and fail to live up to expectations. It happens. Get involved in the democratic process. I'm a candidate that is committed to opening up our democracy, making it a lot more participatory, and ensuring that your generation has a greater voice in the future of this country.
You voted for marijuana.
Yes, so from 5 to 1.
Well, I think you should vote for me. But only if you believe that personal responsibility, freedom, respect, and fairness are values you can live with. That's what we're about. Those are the 4 pillars that every policy on our platform is built upon. We were the first party to announce a no tax for income under $15,000, and I'm proud to say that we have forced the other parties to follow suit. They are now supporting our position. We're the only party to say no more corporate welfare. If we're going to tell Nestle not to take water, we have to stop corporate welfare. Well, the Conservatives are almost there. They'll do it only to the tune of $1.5 billion. We say no more. If those things appeal to you, vote for me.
So thanks for your question. I am not a career politician. I'm a surgeon. I have looked after nearly 10,000 patients, most of them from this riding. I look after patients throughout their lives, from the very young to the very old, and I'm really proud to be part of a party whose philosophy really involves in raising the floor for everyone, where nobody gets left behind. I'm also an advocate for the use of science to craft our legislation. We need evidence behind the things that we do, and we need to be held accountable for that in politics. I think it's well past time for a change in this riding of Wellington Halton Hills. I think we need to demand attention from all of the political parties, and the way that we're going to do that in this riding is by electing a Liberal and turning this into a not safe riding.
Thank you for the question, and welcome to the democracy that we have here in Canada. The first time I voted for a candidate in my riding was because I understood that I wasn't actually voting for the Prime Minister. I was voting for the best person that represented the needs of my community. There are a few things in our democracy that we tend to overlook. Honesty, straightforwardness, acceptability of responsibility, critical analysis, the rule of law. You have an opportunity as a person stepping into this for the first time to avoid what your parents had to go through. 2 parties that we ping-pong back and forth through that failed them, made promises and failed them, made the cost of their living more expensive, made life for them more difficult, was more involved and concerned about the corporations and keeping themselves in power. I can guarantee you that I do not want to be a politician. I've been a leader in the instances that I've been called to lead, and I've always led from the point that I am here to do a job that benefits those people that put me in that position. And that is why I think you should vote for me.
we have a tradition of valuing the opinions of youth, and we have a youth culture in the party at large, and also in this campaign, in this riding. We are serious about the climate crisis, and our whole platform is in line with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is your future, and we are representing that. Our climate plan has consistently been based on COP meetings. Elizabeth May has gone to all these meetings. Our plan is consistent with COP, and it is intended to practically address the issues that we need to address. In the Green Party, we will reduce the voting age to 16, so you've already got to 18, good for you, but some of your colleagues could vote if we were able to bring that through. And we want to eliminate tuition fees. There's a big burden on young people with tuition fees, and we recognize that all the costs to government of people who renege on those fees and paying them back is serious. Now, Michael, I do appreciate your efforts for democratic reform, but it seems to me that your leader is not listening. And maybe...
Bill C-81, Canada's Accessibility Act. How is the federal government... Can you hear me better now? Yeah. Okay, sorry. Bill C-81, Canada's Accessibility Act. How is the federal government going to assure enforcement mechanism is in place to ensure Canada complies with the law to prevent discrimination against people with disabilities?
Here, Sil.
There is legislation coming in Ontario. I know for a fact that I have to retrofit my own properties for accessibility. That is a provincial mandate, and so long as the province meets the intention or the intent of the act, it's not something for the federal government to get involved with.
I'm an able-bodied person, but as a physician, I look after a lot of people with varying degrees of disabilities in my practice. Obviously, I work in a hospital where we try to be accessible, although we desperately need a new hospital that has, wider hallways and better access for people. I was happy to make my own office wheelchair accessible when we built it last year as well. I think there is a role for the federal government to legislate access for people with disabilities. It's very, very important that we have an inclusive society where everybody can participate. It is easy to fix building codes so that things are accessible. Retrofitting, however, is more difficult for those people who are in very old buildings. However, there is still a role for governments, provincial and municipalities, to increase access for everybody with disabilities.
At the end of the day, I believe that we should start with asking those who are in need of these tools what they want and how they feel we should best go about it. I was at a union conference a few years ago where we had to bring a motion to the floor. And it wasn't until the motion was brought to the floor that the members of our union and those in the audience realized how inadequate the accommodations that we had made for those people with those specific needs was. And part of the problem was those who made the decisions as to where the microphones were placed, how many ramps were available, were not the ones that were in the need. So I think we have to start with talking to those people that have that specific need and having them tell us what needs to be done and making sure it gets done.
I think that it's really important to recognize that those who experience the world differently bring value to all of us. So it's not just us giving something to people who are not able-bodied. It's recognizing that they see the world from a different perspective and that they can give us a lot with their experience. I generally believe in diversity overall, and there have been several people I've known that have been in my life who are disabled, and they enrich my life, and they help me to understand more about how the world really works. So I think we should see this as something that is going to enrich all of us as we help those who are disabled to get around and to be accessible to all places and to have the opportunity to interact with us as much as possible so that we can all have a better life.
Michael John?
Well, thank you for the question. Before I answer it, I've just been hearing the phrase career politician. I'll just say this. President Clinton, President Obama were career politicians. Prime Minister Jean Chrétien was a career politician of 40 years. President Trump is not. First time he's held elected office was where he is today. Thank you for the question regarding Bill C-81. I think it's the mark of a society and how it treats its most vulnerable. Federal legislation with respect to persons with disabilities and access for persons with disabilities applies to only 10% of workplaces. 90% of workplaces across the country are regulated by provincial legislation. With respect to the federal government, we regulate about 10%. Airlines, banks, railways, and those sorts of things. And I'm committed to ensuring that those facilities are up to standard. I'm also committed to helping local organizations, not-for-profits, and charities get grant dollars to ensure that their facilities are accessible. And we've done exactly that in recent years in Wellington Halton Hills. There are a number of organizations here, churches, other not-for-profits that have received dollars that we've helped obtain for them to ensure that they have wheelchair access, that they have mini elevators that allow persons with disability to access all parts of the building. And I'm committed to working with local groups to ensure that that kind of funding continues.
Our next question is, when and how will you address affordable senior housing? And we'll start with Dr. Barron.
So affordable housing, especially for seniors, has been something that I've heard a lot about in the thousands of doors that I've knocked on in the last few months. My mother has Alzheimer's and had to move out of the house that I was raised in Ancaster 4 years ago. So I have been through this process, unfortunately, with her. Really, she desperately wanted to stay in Ancaster, where she'd lived for over 4 years, and there was simply nowhere for her to go. So she had to come up here to Georgetown, where at least she was close to her family. Unfortunately, her care needs then increased, and in March, we had to move her to a nursing home in Fergus. So I have been through this process. My heart really bleeds for my senior patients who are referred to me, who tell me that they've actually had to move out of Halton Hills to places like Wasaga Beach, where the housing is more affordable for them on a fixed income. It would be certainly a top priority for me to have affordable housing built in Wellington Halton Hills. I met my first voter who was homeless while door knocking in Erin, and he told me his story, and I was absolutely speechless. He's on a 6-year waiting list for affordable housing. This is completely unacceptable in this riding. Then I met another man whose apartment block had been sold, and he had been asked to leave even though he'd lived there for 18 years, and he was having trouble finding another apartment to live in. We really need to increase the supply of our affordable housing. Housing experts are telling us that this will not happen with market solutions. We need to look at other alternatives of governments either on their own or partnering with industry to increase the supply of affordable housing, particularly for our seniors, and using things like rent geared to income so that it remains affordable for them. Housing is one of the most important things that we can do to improve health.
I can understand and appreciate the position of trying to get into affordable housing when you reach a certain age and you've done everything that you could possibly do to make sure that you're in a position to afford it, and it's not. But there's another aspect of affordable housing that I don't think we ever mention, and I will mention it in regards to the situation members of my family, my mom and dad, and their generation are facing. They own their home. They bought it in 1991 at a fair market price, and it's now valued at over $1 million. They're retired, and their income, based on the choices that they made, is limited. Yet the bills that they have to pay don't change. They actually go up with every year. Their old age pension doesn't go up to the same degree of those bills increasing. So one of the things we need to address is the cost of maintaining a home if you are lucky enough to be in one, increasing your old age pension so it at least keeps up with inflation, and perhaps we should look at the drastic step of reducing the property tax that you pay based on the assessment of the value of your home. That's it.
Thank you. One of the things that the Green Party will do is look at the Canada Pension Plan and increase it from 25 to 50% of the working income. So that would help quite a bit to address the issue of being able to afford in the affordable part of the housing for seniors. We also, in the Green Party, have a plan to have 25,000 new units per year for 10 years and 15,000 retrofitted units per year for 10 years. We will invest $750 million in new units and $750 million in rental units, making it more affordable for all people, but particularly seniors. And our guaranteed livable income is a floor income, and it's been studied by many folks, including the Fraser Institute. And a few years ago, there were two economists who said that it would be about 1/3 the cost. This would be a luxury guaranteed livable income of all the other programs. So that would give us room to keep some of the programs that we have and to make sure that there's a floor income, and we're the only party, as far as I know, that is posing that. And with respect to housing, I just want to tell the story about a mayor in Lethbridge, in a very conservative town. He realized that he was having a lot of costs with homeless people who could not afford housing, some of which were seniors. And this is with police services, first responders, hospital bills, and so on. He built homes for all the homeless people in Lethbridge, and it cost less than it did to provide all those services when they were homeless, and they were much happier.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you for the question. This is an important issue, especially as housing has appreciated significantly in the Greater Toronto Area over the last number of years. Over the last several years, I've worked with local groups to help build new affordable housing units here in town. We worked with the Carruthers Co-op just up the road here, in ensuring that CMHC was made available to them, to ensure that the financing was there to do some of the work that needed to be done. About 6 years ago, we secured some $3 million in funding for 44 new affordable housing units on Mountain View Road here in Georgetown at St. Andrew's United Church that is providing affordable housing units. But more needs to be done. I think I will continue to work with local council, Mayor Rick Bennett, and other members of council, regional council, in order to ensure that more units continue to be built. The other thing, though, I think that's important is that seniors, as Andrew's mentioned, often face escalating costs and property taxes and other things that they struggle to pay every month. And it's been recently reported that half of Canadian households are $200 away from insolvency every month. And so I think another part of the equation is putting a little bit more money in people's pockets. That's why we're proposing to increase the age credit for seniors by $1,000 a year. We're also proposing to implement a universal tax cut that will put up to $450 for a working person or a senior that receives income, and up to $850 for a working couple or for dual income senior household in order to help them with the cost of paying the monthly bills.
To Michael's point briefly, to bring up U.S.-style politics really contributes to the polarization of politics here in Canada. We don't need this. We need to work together, and just to bring it up is counterproductive. Just as a caveat here, I am an operator of rental housing. I have operated rental housing in 3 provinces, BC, Ontario, and Quebec. All 3 provinces have a form of rent control. I can tell you that rent control in Ontario benefits every landlord. It's not to the benefit of the tenant. We need to face the reality. Rental housing built by government is not somewhere where most people want to live. We need to make it favorable for the private sector to develop more units. The private sector needs a stable environment where they can capitalize their development and show their lenders that they have a secure source of income. We need to put the emphasis to support the tenants back to the government and stop asking the private sector to subsidize tenants by keeping rents artificially low or outside of the market forces. Once the supply catches up with the demand, prices will come down. That's just economics 101.
So, thank you. And the next question is from Jim Gray. In my opinion, the defense budget for our country is inadequate. What do you propose to do? And this time we're going to start with Mr. Andrew Bass.
When I was growing up, I used to see the commercials on television for the American military. They were bold, they were aggressive, they wanted me to become a Marine. But I live in Canada, so that was never going to be a possibility. Throughout the history of our country, we've had brave men and women taking part and making sure that other countries have the democracy that they require at a sacrifice to our own men and women. Our governments have always underfunded the needs of these individuals. I would make sure as a member of the NDP that changes. I would make sure that they are treated with the respect that they deserve and shown how much we appreciate them by making sure that their sacrifices have never been in vain. Thank you.
In the Green Party, the way we look at the military is that they're a resource that should be used within Canada as much as possible. Outside of Canada, we should return to a peacekeeping role as much as possible. So getting back to within Canada, we need ways to deploy the military, and we need to have a system in place to deploy the military as we have more frequent weather disasters and weather events where this is required. We also need to have them trained to fight forest fires and be prepared to deal with floods and that type of thing. It shouldn't just be ad hoc. This is something that they should be trained for. I think that some of the other things with regard to the military, it always strikes me that the ads that invite young people to go into the military are very compelling, but they don't show what happens to those who get PTSD or those who suffer serious injuries. And I think the part of the military that really needs more funding is the veterans. We need to honor them and to make sure that they're dealt with fairly. They should not suffer in poverty after risking their lives for our country. And I think that in the Green Party, we also have a position that we would stop aid to Saudi. We would not send them any more military equipment. And we would also ban autonomous weapons. That is too risky, and we feel that we should not go ahead with that, so we would stop that.
Well, thank you for the question. You know, in the words of John Manley, Canada's been a free rider for many decades on the NATO alliance, and when the bill comes, we get up and go to the bathroom, unfortunately. The fact of the matter is that the NATO alliance has commitments from members to spend 2% of their GDP on defense. Canada does not even meet half of that commitment in most years, and we haven't for decades. Canada hasn't met its overseas development assistance goals for over 2 decades. We've committed 0.7% of our GDP to foreign aid, and we don't even spend half of that. We have made climate change commitments in Kyoto, in Copenhagen, in Paris, and we don't meet those commitments. So I think a big part of the solution here is a strengthened House of Commons that is going to hold prime ministers and their governments accountable for these international commitments so that they will be upheld, like they once were in past generations. You know, we're on the verge of the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the Netherlands. We just had the 75th anniversary of D-Day, where tens of thousands of Canadians paid the ultimate price to uphold Canada's word. Back then, Canada's word was its bond. We have squandered that inheritance as a country, and we need to do better. So I'm committed to ensuring that governments uphold these commitments by constantly calling them out for a lack of commitment to our NATO defense spending. We spend about $20 billion a year on defense. Our commitment is 40. We can no longer be free riders. The United States is no longer the kind of benevolent partner it once was. It increasingly is looking out for itself. The United Kingdom exceeds its NATO commitments, spends more than 2% of its GDP. Most of the other NATO members spend far more than Canada proportionately. We need to do better, and I agree with Jim Gray on this 100%.
The Conservatives created a mess with our veterans' pensions while they were in power. We brought forward a policy to restore what they lost with the Conservatives. Upon governing, we will restore every bit of pension that they have lost. It's surprising to me that we are still allowed to underfund our commitment with our military. The U.S., our largest partner, has been very patient with us. It's time for us to step up. If we can just get to a balanced budget, if they give us that courtesy, I think we need to ramp up our spending in military to the 2% target of our GDP. Our enemies changed. War is not what it was. It's far costlier now to keep our borders secure. And it's not just our long, unprotected border and our shores. There is a serious threat with online hacking and to our electrical grid. Those are issues that should be taken care of by our military, and we need to be serious about it and fund them properly.
So the Liberal government, since 2015, has increased defense spending by 70% to $32 billion, and that's committed over the last 10 years. I think the nature of our military has changed. We do live in a more peaceful world. There has been a focus for Canada's military on peacekeeping missions, and I think that will continue under a Liberal government. However, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Andrew Scheer has recently announced that he will cut foreign aid spending by 25%. Canada already spends an embarrassingly low amount of its GDP on foreign aid. Now, I don't know how many of you remember the movie Charlie Wilson's War, but it outlines the journey of a politician in the United States who sought funding when the Russians invaded Afghanistan, and that military mission was ultimately successful. The movie, unfortunately, ends with a refusal of the American government to go in and do rebuilding funding in Afghanistan, and a big hole was left there, which was filled in by ISIS and the Taliban. Ultimately, it was suggested leading to 9/11. I think it's really important for Canada to step up with international aid to stabilize regions that are poor and where forces move in to destabilize democratic governments. My family's from Northern Ireland, and one of the defining really memories of me as a child growing up was my dad taking me back to Belfast at Christmas time. It was at the height of the Troubles. And I think watching tanks in the streets and being frisked by British soldiers who were there to support peace, really in my brain at that point, it made me appreciate what it was to live in a stable Canadian democracy.
And with the next question, we'll start with Mr. Ralph Martin, and the question is from, I hope I say your last name correctly, Ron Patava. When will we have a balanced budget? Did you hear me? When we'll have a balanced budget?
The Green Party is committed to having a balanced budget in 5 years. We think that is reasonable. We are very fiscally responsible, and I would say fiscally conservative. We're socially progressive, but fiscally conservative. As my daughter tells me, she doesn't want my environmental mess, neither does she want my debt. And so I think we should try to balance our budget within this time. We're the only party that has submitted 23 of our planks and our platform to the Parliamentary Budget Officer. The Conservatives, 13, the NDP, 3, and the others not at all. And we do this in the interest of accountability and transparency. We want everybody to see what it is that our platform is going to cost, and we think that's a good way to proceed. I think with budgets, we often hear about the debt to GDP ratio, and we're told that if it's at 30%, that's good. I really worry about that because we've been in good times, and we've been running deficits in good economic times, and the wheel will turn, and we will go into recession at some point, and then the debt to GDP ratio will shift very quickly. I won't bother going into a mathematics lesson about how that will work, but I understand that we're within a realm of safety, but I think, as Michael said last night, that it's not only the federal government, there are provincial governments that are in debt, and there are a lot of households that are really in debt, and we have to think about that as a whole picture and try to make sure that we manage so that we have some resilience at the federal level when things get a little bit worse, as they invariably will economically.
Well, thank you for the question. I agree with Ralph. I think 5 years is a reasonable amount of time to balance a budget. That's exactly what the Conservatives and Mr. Scheer are proposing. I think any time frame shorter than that will lead to disruption and cuts to essential services that Canadians need. I remember the time between 1995 and 1998 when the Chrétien-Martin government balanced the budget in 3 years. There were dramatic cuts to the healthcare and education transfers to the provinces, a 25% cut in 1995 alone that had huge, massive impacts on public education, on public healthcare, not just here in Ontario, but across the country. So I think 5 years is a reasonable amount of time. Mr. Harper did it that amount of time and returned the budget balance in 2015. He did it through a lot of efficiencies in the core federal public service. We took the core federal public service from about 200,000 persons down to, by about 18,000, 19,000 people. 2/3 of that was done through attrition. 1/3 was done through direct layoffs. A modest amount for the largest employer in the country. So I think 5 years is a reasonable amount of time, but as Ralph's pointed out, our federal debt is not of grave concern right now. But when you look at the aggregate debt levels of provincial, federal governments, of municipal governments, along with the private sector and along with households, Canada is at dangerously high indebted levels. And governments, particularly the federal government in this country, needs to be on track to balance budgets because we are the shock absorber of the national economy. When Canada hits a recession, it's federal finances that are most affected. Revenues plummet and costs skyrocket as the shock absorbers of employment insurance, old age guaranteed income supplement, and other support programs kick in as equalization transfers swell. So we need to be prepared for that eventuality, and I think it's prudent to balance in 5 years. The current government has no plan to balance it anytime near in the future.
What a mess. 650 billion. They increased the debt, the Liberals, by 70 billion. We owe 350 in Ontario. That's $1 trillion. That's sad. We will balance the budget in 2 years. The Chrétien Martin government did it in 3 years. I was so happy that I was employed with the government at the time. Initially, they came out and told us, do more with less. Eventually, they realized that we couldn't do that. Then they told us, do less with less. We managed. We balanced the budget, and it allowed us to expand on social programs. To carry on at the levels that we are at now, let's face it, at some point, there will be threats to our social programs. We can't carry on. We will require pipelines to be built to be able to balance budgets and pay for the social services that we have been accustomed to, the health care that we cherish. 2 years, that is our platform.
So the Liberal plan is to run modest deficits. I am not an economist, but when I don't have expertise in an area and I am caring for my patients, I generally go and get expertise from other entities, other specialists. So I am going to listen to the economists on this one. There is not much daylight between the Conservative plan and the Liberal plan in terms of balancing the budget at this point. Canada invests the lowest amount as a percentage of its GDP on social programs. We know if we don't invest in poverty reduction, in making sure that people have secure and affordable housing, that we pay the price downstream. We pay it in our emergency rooms, we pay it in people having health problems, we pay it in the corrections. It makes far more sense to spend money upstream to ensure that these problems never develop in the first place. And I'm proud to be part of a Liberal government that has said that, like investing in your house to improve its value, it will invest in the people of Canada to make this country a better place for everyone.
4 years ago, our present Prime Minister said the budget will balance itself. You've heard the numbers from Michael, from Ralph, from Sil. You've heard what Leslie's had to say. I am not a politician. I am not a banker. I'm not an accountant. The only budget balancing I have to do is between myself and my wife. And that entails making sacrifices. I gave the answer that yesterday that I'll give to you today. When the NDP feels that we as a society can afford a balanced budget, we will balance the budget. That is, for me, the only thing that makes sense. Because, as he says, revenues go down, but your taxes go up. What are you getting from a balanced budget? It is a political ploy to say, hey, look what we're doing. But they're doing it at a cost to you. So you tell us when you're ready to pay the price to get to that political place, and then we'll balance the budget.
Our next question is, many target shooters are concerned that their sport is threatened. What is your position on handguns as it pertains to legitimate shooters at gun clubs?
This is 100 debates on climate. When are we going to have a climate question? There's 5 questions in a row.
This-
We want climate questions.
Well, you had your debate on climate at the beginning, and our posters did say that the second half were general questions. We're going to start with Mr. Chong this time.
Well, thank you for the question. I think any gun policy, any firearm policy needs to be based on evidence. And the current government's firearms policy is not based on evidence. Here's the fact. As the Globe and Mail has reported most recently, I think last week, there is no data on where handguns are coming from that are used in the commission of a crime or a murder. We do not have data. There is no data. And so we don't know if these are legally obtained handguns that are then used in the commission of a crime, in which case a handgun ban is something that is based on something, or they are illegally obtained handguns that have been smuggled across the Canada-US border and are used in the commission of crime, in which case a handgun ban doesn't make any difference, because a handgun ban, as the Liberals have proposed, only applies to legally obtained firearms that are currently legally available. So this is an example of a party that's playing politics with this issue. At the end of the day, this is what I believe. Canada has long licensed and regulated the use of handguns in this country since the 1930s. I support that system. I support the licensing system. We also have millions of farmers, hunters, and other people who legally use long arms. And I support their right as law-abiding citizens to use those in the conduct of their work, in the pursuit of their passions. I believe in our licensing system, and I think any party that plays politics with this issue actually is dividing Canadians in rural Canada against Canadians in urban areas, and any gun policy needs to be based on evidence, and we just simply do not have the data on where handguns are coming from in the commission of these crimes in our large cities.
I mentioned earlier that I was employed with the government for a little bit. It was with the RCMP. Michael, we know where they come from. We need to change the focus at the border from revenue to enforcement. Customs officers have to stop looking for your extra bottle of wine and the cigarettes and need to start looking for criminals smuggling the firearms. That's where they are coming from.
You're making them.
Once we find the smugglers, they need to be processed through the judicial system. I can tell you that it's incredibly frustrating to conduct an investigation that will take a year, 2 years sometimes, because the burden of proof in Canada is so extensive, as it should be, to end up with a criminal back out on the street 6 months after he was caught. This is part of the reason why I'm here. As a policeman, I had no control over what the judicial did. as a legislator, that will be a different story. We will be tough on criminals and leave the legal gun owners alone.
So as a surgeon working in Canada, I have thankfully not had to deal with a lot of firearm injuries, and I certainly wouldn't want that to be a trend that increases. The Liberal government has increased funding to Canadian Border Services and the RCMP to try and stop the importation of illegal firearms, most of them coming across the border from the United States. The Liberal government has promised a ban on military assault rifles. Nobody who is a private citizen needs a military-style assault rifle with a high-capacity magazine, as we've seen used in mass shootings in the United States. Nobody wants to take guns away from hunters and law-abiding citizens who are using them for recreation, as long as they are properly stored and secured. Unfortunately, what the data shows us is that if there is a firearm in the home, it is most likely to be used either in a suicide or a femicide where a woman is killed by her partner. That is what the data shows. The Liberal government has not proposed a handgun ban. That is false. The Liberal government has said it will leave it up to municipalities if they want to ban handguns or not.
Pass the buck.
I'm going to try to tie this into a number of things. First of all, there seems to be a lot of governing that takes place based on not my priority, not my responsibility. We're all citizens of this country. We all pay taxes to the same entity, those people we elect to do the things that we're too busy to be able to do ourselves. We ask them to protect us, we ask them to educate us, we ask them to take care of our health system, guard our borders, take care of our environment, and do the best job they can at it while we're off doing the rest of the things we need to do for ourselves. I have friends that own guns legally. What they have to go through in order to be able to use that weapon, because that's what it is ridiculous. But they do it because they are legal gun owners. A ban affects them by increasing their ability to do what they need to do and by making it more difficult to do that. Farmers have the weapons they have for the reasons that they need them. Criminals don't care. Plain and simple, right? We need to stop talking about where the guns are coming from, whether they're making them or getting them from across the border. We need to be able to lock these people up whenever they commit any crime that involves a handgun. Plain and simple. And never let them back out on the street.
Well, in the Green Party, we agree that we have to increase the Canadian border security to screen guns as they come in and to make sure that they're looking for them and try to stop them coming in at the border. So we would increase the budget. I don't remember the number, but I know that I read that in our platform. We support the right of farmers and hunters to use guns for these legitimate purposes. In the Green Party, we are clear. We would ban handguns and we would ban assault rifles, except as regulated for target shooters. Thank you.
And the next question is from Eleanor Young and David Wilson. How would your party reconcile climate change action with our reliance on a strong energy resource-based economy? And this time we will start with Mr. Cow.
Our oil industry is one of the most responsible in the world. You know, in a perfect world, we would live without oil. The reality is that even banning single-use plastics made from petrochemicals will have an impact. It's not just the fork at Swiss Chalet. It's far more than that, or the straw. The medical field has so much plastic in it. What, are we just going to stop using it? No. We need to use the resources that we have here. It is far more ecologically sensible to use something that's in our backyard than to get it from across the ocean from a regime that has zero respect for human rights. It's time we take a serious look at our way of life and be critical. Yes, we need to do better, absolutely. But it has to be in a context of reality.
Canada is a country filled with natural resources, and I think the plan to use those resources to transition onto a clean energy economy makes sense. It's going to be a gradual transition. It's going to be too fast for some and too slow for others. And really watching the Liberal Party get attacked from both sides says to me, maybe we're on the right track with how we're going about this. Solar panels, wind turbines, investing in green technology companies to improve how our electric vehicles run, how our batteries are stored. That all takes money. And what does Canada have to sell to the rest of the world? Well, we have our natural resources, including fossil fuels. The Liberal government bought the Trans Mountain Pipeline with the promise that every penny of profit from that pipeline will be plowed into the development of renewables. This was not about taking more oil out of the ground. Currently, that oil is being shipped in a much more unsafe way by rail. It was simply a matter of being able to get a fair price for our oil. There is a difference between Western Canada crude and Western Texas crude. And currently, they are fracking so much in the US that they are meeting their supply, and we are almost having to give our oil away. So every penny of profit from that pipeline will be plowed back into renewables so that we can reach a carbon neutral economy by 2050.
Part of the NDP's New Deal for the Climate Action Plan and good paying jobs will reduce emissions twice as fast as the Liberals, create 300,000 jobs, invest in clean energy products like a climate bank, invest massively in electrifying of transit, retrofit homes across the country, and put more zero-emission vehicles on the road. When I went to the NDP and asked them to look at allowing me to be the candidate, one of the concerns they had was my own opinion on the pipeline, and they asked me about it. And I said, you know, it's odd that we tend to take a narrow view of how we go about dealing with the fact that we actually have a pipeline. I remember in the 80s and the late 70s, we had refinery capacity in this country. And I know going back to that brings its own environmental concerns, but at least it would help alleviate the need for the pipeline. So I would at least suggest we at least take a look at those types of things, and then of course ask the other people who are dealing with climate what they're doing, because there are other jurisdictions out there that are making advances, and for whatever reason, we haven't tagged along with it.
So in Canada, we are rich in resources, and over the last 100 years, we've used those resources very well. We're going into a new era. We're now in the second decade of the 21st century. In the 20th century, we had to depend on oil and gas. Now we know that we have to move off. We have about 60 to 70,000 people employed in oil and gas. We have more now employed in the new green economy in jobs that will persist and that are anticipating where the economy is going, or where the puck is going, if you will. So there are investment funds that are now divesting from oil and gas. The Norway Fund is the big one. They started based on oil, and now they're divesting from oil and gas. A lot of ethical investment funds are also divesting from fossil fuels and oil and gas. As we go into more electric cars and cars that are non-internal combustion, whether they be electric or hydrogen, but especially with electric, we have the opportunity to charge those car batteries with retrofitted homes that we have in our Green Party plan. And if you don't drive enough during the day to use up that charge, you can feed it back into the grid during the day and get paid for that. So there are ways in the new economy that we can be employed, that we can be engaged, that we can grow, that we can do the things that we want to do in a vibrant society.
Well, thank you for the question, Eleanor and David. I appreciate it. I think that, well, first off, oil and gas accounts for about 25% of all Canadian emissions. And even if we were to eliminate the oil and gas industry, it doesn't even get us to Paris. So I don't think it serves national unity purposes, the goals of our economy, to pit one sector of the economy against another, or one region of the economy against another. I think that we can sustainably develop these resources provided that we price carbon, either through a carbon tax, some parties are proposing, or through a regulatory sector-by-sector approach. And I think that price on carbon, whether direct or indirect, through regulation or other means, should be priced equitably across the country and across the regions of across the sectors of our economy and the regions of this country. At the end of the day, tailpipe emissions in this country from transportation are equal to the entire oil and gas industry. And so we should focus on that just as much as we focus on reducing the output from Alberta's oil and gas industry. The fact of the matter is that not building pipelines isn't the way to achieve the results. I agree with the Liberals on this issue. At the end of the day, when we had a problem with pollutants coming from the tailpipes of automobiles in the 1970s that were pouring out lead and other noxious substances into our atmosphere, we did ban the construction of new highways or new roads and new bridges. We regulated tailpipe emissions at their source. We demanded catalytic converters, we demanded other fuel efficiency standards for those automobiles, and the industry responded. And today, the pollution, setting aside greenhouse gases, coming out of the tailpipes of our automobiles is a fraction of what it once was. And so that's the way to tackle greenhouse gases. Tackle it at source, not by banning the construction of new pipelines, but by ensuring a consistent approach across all sectors and regions of this economy and country.
And we have a question from Spencer and from Rob Rosie. The questions are very similar, so I'm going to just read it as one. How will you, as the local candidate, support what we need here in Halton, Wellington, while you're there in Ottawa, especially if there's a minority government? How would you go about voting? Would it be according to party platform or according to what this riding needs? And we start with Dr. Bennett this time.
So I've looked after a lot of people in the riding, as I've said, and you don't look after patients who treat the illnesses I do, breast cancer, colon cancer, perforated bowels, things that are often quite devastating to people's health, and that obviously also affects them economically. So I think I would bring that experience of looking after my patients, not just in isolation with their disease, but also with their social situation, to advocate for the people of this riding in Ottawa. I know affordable housing is a massive issue here. I know climate change causes a lot of anxiety for the people of the riding. We don't know if this year is going to be the next year where we have a massive ice storm, where your power is going to be out and you're going to have burst pipes in your house. These are really concerns for the people of the riding. And I would commit to working with anybody who is interested in improving the lives of the people of Wellington Halton Hills.
Just 1 second. I forgot to say that that was the last question before the closing remarks, just so that everybody knows. Keep on.
This debate tonight allows us the opportunity as the candidates vying for your permission to represent you, to tell you what it is we are able to do. But I think we can use this in reverse and have these types of meetings for you to tell us what it is you need. And in my lifetime as a leader in any position that I've held, that is always the way I've functioned. My goal is to get my team the answers that they seek. My goal is to be a voice for my team. But my first goal and my first responsibility is to the needs of my team. And I want you to be part of that. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. In the Green Party, we vote, when we go to Ottawa as MPs, we vote for our riding. So in the three big parties, they tend to follow their party leaders. If they do not agree with their party leaders, they have to let them know ahead of time, and there are often consequences. They are disciplined or sometimes kicked out of the party. In the Green Party, if there is an issue that we have not campaigned on, then I will check with you, all of you in the riding, and if you want me to vote a certain way, I will. And Elizabeth May will check with her riding, and if they want her to vote that way, and you in this riding want me to vote opposite, I go with you. I don't have to vote the same way that Elizabeth May does. Now, if it's an issue that we have campaigned on, like climate change, then of course we will all vote together, because we want to keep our promise and we're all committed to those issues that we are campaigning on. But it is really important to know that in the Green Party, we do this. It's neither dramatic nor exceptional. It's just the way we do business. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob and Spencer, for that question. I think it's important for members of Parliament to represent their constituents, firstly and foremostly. I think we have subverted our constitutional order in this country in recent decades. That's why I've been fighting for things like reforms to the House of Commons and to political parties, to allow MPs a greater voice in the House of Commons, to hold party leaders, particularly the Prime Minister, to greater account. You know, the Canadian Constitution does not mention the word parties or party caucuses or political parties even once, but it mentions the election of individual members of Parliament and members of Parliament dozens of times. And so our constitutional order was set up to elect 338 individual members to Parliament to represent 338 different constituencies in this country. And I think we need to return to a system where we rebalance power between party leaders and the Prime Minister, and that's something I'm very much committed to. It's something I practice. I usually vote with my party on most issues, but from time to time, when I hear from constituents, I will break rank and stand up and vote accordingly. That's why Green PAC has endorsed me. I'm one of the 25 candidates across this country, of some 2,000 candidates in this federal election, who has been endorsed by a leading environmental group made up of environmentalists from universities like the University of Ottawa that have endorsed this campaign here in Wellington Halton Hills, one of 25. And we are the only campaign in Halton region from 24 candidates running across 5 ridings to be endorsed. I'm proud of that record on the environment. I've worked with Green leader Elizabeth May on starting the All-Party Climate Change Caucus. I've worked with Kennedy Stewart in the NDP and Liberal MP Scott Sims on democratic reforms. I will continue work across the aisle based on what I'm hearing from my constituents. That's my track record, and that's what I'm committed to continuing.
The Liberal government was elected with a mandate for electoral reform. Well, we all know what happened with that. Michael was on the right track with his Reform Act to reform the PMO. Unfortunately, the Liberal government didn't sign on. That's gone too now. Our leader used to be with the Conservative Party. Maxime Bernier left the party because you had to vote with the party on every issue. Michael paid a dear price. for not voting with the party. There's a bit of a pattern here. Liberals, conservatives, we're bringing a fresh approach. I will be able to vote the way you ask me to vote. I will consult with you on a regular basis. You will have my, this is going to be cliche, but you'll have my phone number if you so want to reach me and discuss issues on an ongoing basis. This is how our democracy should work. I will vote the way you want me to vote, with the People's Party, and let it be the new way of doing politics in Canada.
Now we will have the closing remarks. Each candidate has 2 minutes for their closing remarks. We are starting this time with Mr. Michael Chong and going this way towards Mr. Sylvain Cal, who will speak last. 2 minutes each for the timer.
Thank you, Margaret, for moderating, and thank you all for coming out. I hope you found it educational and entertaining evening. Thanks to the Halton Environmental Network, as well as the Canadian Federation of University Women Georgetown chapter for hosting this as well. I'll just summarize by saying that I think this campaign here in Wellington Halton Hills is important for 2 reasons. The first reason it's important is whether or not this Liberal government deserves another mandate. And I think on that question, the answer is most decidedly no. They promised to run only 3 years of modest deficits and return to budget balance this year. They broke that promise. They promised electoral reform. They broke that promise. They promised that they would do foreign policy differently. Our foreign policy is in shambles. The Prime Minister's trip to India was an embarrassment of a magnitude we have never seen on the world stage. They promised to uphold the highest standards of ethics and accountability. They not only interfered with the independence of our justice system and the independence of the Office of the Attorney General, the Prime Minister then broke the law and did something illegal. He kicked Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott out of caucus without following the provisions of the Reform Act, even though he said he supported it. Most importantly, this election is also about which of the candidates here on stage can best represent you in Ottawa, who will be a strong voice for you, who will stand up for the things that you believe in, like environmental issues. And on that, my record is clear, and I have the determination and the experience to continue the fight for you in Ottawa, but I can't do it without your help. On October 21st, I need your vote, I need your support. Thank you very much for coming out this evening.
Thank you to the organizers for organizing this. Thank you to all of you for coming out. You're making democracy work. That's great. As a truck driver, bus driver, server, and farmer, I know the value of a hard-earned dollar and what it means to work with my hands. As a scientist, I know the difference between good and bad science, and this applies to the real climate crisis. I have a history of speaking scientific truth to power. As your MP, I will also vote truth to power, and that's a normal practice in the Green Party. Greens have a bold and inspiring vision for what Canada can be, for what Canada must be by 2030. We offer you a chance to vote for what you want. Our Mission Possible is a made-in-Canada plan and lines up with the recommendations or exceeds the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to meet their targets. Elizabeth May and Mike Schreiner show that Greens are a great choice. With other voters coming my way in this riding, I urge you to vote for me so that as Green MPs, we can hold a minority Liberal or minority Conservative government to account and then develop a clean and caring economy for our kids to inherit. So what is the political landscape today? The federal Liberals bought a pipeline with our money, dropped their promised electoral reform, and are still running deficits. The federal Conservatives under Andrew Scheer do not have a credible climate plan and are lining up with Doug Ford and Jason Kenney. And recently, Hugh Segal, a former PC senator, said, anyone who is a red Tory, read progressive Conservative, it's now the Conservative Party, has no choice but to vote Green. In 2019, voters in Wellington Halton Hills will look to those of us in the Green Party who are practical to restore ecological, social, and fiscal resilience. Thank you.
For me, it becomes a question of whether we can afford another 4 years of Justin Trudeau or the return of Stephen Harper Light with Andrew Scheer. I don't think so, so I'm asking you to make a bold new direction with Jagmeet Singh and myself as the NDP representatives in Ottawa. We will bring accountability, honesty, and respect for people, the environment, and the rule of law back to government and to all Canadians. Honesty, openness, straightforwardness, acceptability for responsibilities of my actions, and a critical analysis of my strengths and weaknesses, coupled with the understanding of what I have yet to learn from others and their knowledge and experiences. Those are the things that make Andrew Bascom the person I am. These are some of the cornerstones of our Canada that I feel is missing in our elected officials at present. We must continue to challenge what has become an unacceptable norm in our politics today, putting wealthy corporations ahead of people. Working on staying in power instead of serving the communities and the country is not good governance, it's bad politics. The notion that the way things have been done is the only way they can be done is something I continue to challenge as a human being. We must question and challenge those positions and those who tell us things will never change. Better the devil you know, as a determining factor in who you choose to vote for needs to be challenged. Those who would have you believe you have only one choice between the two parties, the Liberals and Conservatives, even though they acknowledge the failures of both parties, are only fostering their own narrative. We must move away from this hypocrisy. We must ask tough questions of elected officials, hold them accountable to us, not to the party, and certainly not to the wealthy corporations and special interest groups. Remind our elected officials they work for us, but they also must work with us for everyone's best interests. That is why I'm asking you to send me to Ottawa to be your candidate, to be your representative, to bring respect to the environment, a sense of duty to your country and to your community, to understand we're in it for you.
I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the Canadian Federation of University Women and the Halton Environmental Network for hosting, and for all of you for coming out tonight and your questions. We've all talked a lot about policy and about what our parties intend to do if we're successful in the coming election. And as voters, everyone here will have a big decision to make on October the 21st. But as you contemplate your options and where you'll decide to cast your votes in a few weeks, it's important to keep in mind what is all of this for. For me, it's very simple. I want my 3 kids to grow up in a better Canada. I think everyone wants that. But wanting is easy. Actually sitting down and thinking about what better means and how you get there is very hard. That means making choices, some of them difficult. For me, the Canada I want is for my kids and for everyone's kids to grow up with no poverty. It's where seniors like my mom and one day all Canadians can retire with dignity. It's where people can count on healthy bodies and healthy minds because they don't have to wait too long to access medical or mental health care. And arching over all of this, I want our kids and grandkids to grow up in a Canada and a world where the climate hasn't turned on them because of the short-sightedness and neglect of my generation and the ones that came before. That's what I want for my kids and your kids, and that's why I'm in politics. And I'm with the Liberals because they're the ones who are actually looking forward with a clear vision, who see these challenges and want not only to solve them, but to do it while minimizing the worst effects on people's livelihoods. The other parties, some of them see those same problems, but their plans are too unrealistic, too disruptive, or damaging. Still, other parties don't even think we can solve these problems, or in the case of climate change, that we shouldn't even try. The Liberals know there's a better way. I hope you'll choose to go forward with the Liberal Party and to go forward in a way that lifts everyone up. I hope I can count on your vote on October 21st so we can send a Liberal MP to Ottawa as a new, energized voice for Wellington Halton Hills. Thank
you. Mr. Carroll?
Finally found something to agree with Andrew on. We don't need another Liberal government or a Conservative government. The fiasco with our foreign relations. We have now hog farmers, grain farmers, paying the price for incompetence, gross incompetence with the Huawei affair. It should have never happened. The inexperience is the cause of the price that our farmers are paying now because their exports are under tariff with China. Our government will finally start on electoral reform. We will introduce recall legislation. We also believe in term limits. An MP that's been representing you since 2004 loses effectiveness. While there might be lots of experience in one area, there's more to politics than talking like a politician. As you can tell, I'm not one of them. We will kill the carbon tax. That's costing you far too much for zero impact. We are seeing this in British Columbia. Their emissions are going up. We will restore integrity in government. If this is something that appeals to you on the 21st, support me. Thank you.
To all our candidates. In the name of the Canadian Federation of University Women, the Halton Environmental Network, and the Halton Hills Public Library, I would like to first of all thank the ASL person who worked so hard this evening to I think you managed to keep up with everything that was being said up here, and there was a lot being said. I'd like to thank all of you for coming tonight. Bonne nuit, good night, safe drive home, soyez prudents sur la route. Most important, get out and vote. Arrivederci.
Do 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 do.